We have all had those moments where we look back on a conflict, we shake our heads and think, why did I handle it that way? With three decades of ministry experience, Donna Jones has had a front row seat to and been in the middle of all kinds of conflict. And she understands the regret, the guilt, the heartache, and the hurt that conflict can produce. But she also knows it's possible for God to use those chaotic, painful moments and turn them into opportunities for better connection with those around us. So, whether you're dealing with daily disagreements or occasional blowups, our discussion today is going to provide you with a new paradigm, one where you learn how to honor God when you've been hurt, communicate when you'd rather retaliate, and move toward others when it seems easier to run away. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I think that you're really going to enjoy today's episode. Today, we're talking about when conflict hurts, choosing healing, honor, and hope over retaliation. But before we get started with the conversation with Donna, I just want to remind you what Proverbs 15:18 says. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. Donna Jones is a national speaker, church planner, pastor's wife, and self-described Bible explainer. She's spoken in more than 26 states and 4 continents. She's a graduate of UCLA with a degree in interpersonal communications, and she hosts the weekly That's Just What I Needed podcast, where I've been honored to be a guest. Donna is passionate about equipping others to know, love, and follow God in their real everyday lives. She wants to know, love, and follow God this way herself. She and her husband, JP, make their home in Southern California. Welcome to the program, Donna.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Michelle. It's just my honor to be here.
When we met, I think you and I just knew that we
Yep.
were destined to collaborate together. And conflict is not one of those things that we often want to race towards. But it's one of those things that we often find disrupt our lives. And I know as a fellow author and podcaster that sometimes, okay, oftentimes, we have to live out the message that we write about. So tell us what motivated you to write this new book.
Yeah. And it's so true. And it's so funny, Michelle. Once I wrote the book, a few people started to say to me, like, really, conflict? Nobody really wants to talk about conflict. And I realized, like, oh, yeah, people really don't. And yet, and yet, everybody wants better relationships, whether it's with their spouse or their in-laws or their kids or their coworkers. Like we all want better relationships. And the one thing that stops us from having the kind of relationships we want is conflict. So it's kind of like, okay, if we want better relationships, and the thing that stops us from having that is conflict and how we deal with it. Well, how about if we just learn to deal with conflict because it's not going away. It's just part of life. So, it's even though it sounds like it's something sort of negative, really, if we can get a handle on it, it can become positive. And your question was what was my personal experience with this? Um, Several years ago, my husband worked for a church, a former church, and we went through a really, really devastating church hurt experience. And it threw me for a loop, Michelle, because I just, it's one thing to expect conflict from somebody who's not a believer or hurt from someone who's not a believer. But when you are thrown under the bus by somebody who is a professing Christian, that is like next level, right? And so I found myself in this situation where I was really torn because, part of me wanted to do the right thing. The most part of me, all of me wanted to do the right thing. But then the human side of me was like, yeah, but I'm hurt. And I I want to explode, right? So I had lunch with a friend because I was just having one of these days. And I thought, okay, if I could just vent with my best friend, I'll feel better. So we meet at this restaurant and she leans over when we were sure no one was looking or listening. And she goes, how are you doing? And I said, honestly, some days I'd like to burn down the church. And she looked horrified. And she said, I highly recommend you don't repeat that out loud, right? And so she was protecting me because, I mean, that's a horrible thing to say. I wasn't actually serious, but that was just, my emotions. But what I realized is what I was feeling is kind of what we all feel when we're really hurt and wounded in conflict. And of course, I was never really going to burn down the church. What I was really saying is, I want this to stop. And I'll do anything to make the pain go away. And I think whether it's just we're constantly arguing with a teenager or a young adult, child, or a toddler, or our spouse, or, we just kind of want it to stop, right? And we'll do anything, even sometimes, unfortunately, really ineffective or even really ungodly things to make it stop.
Well, not only do we just want it to stop, if we're being very honest, when we've been hurt in our flesh, we
Hmm.
frequently want the other person to
Hmm.
hurt as much as we hurt.
Yep.
That's not the biblical way, but let's be honest and
Yeah.
say it hurts so bad that we wish that they knew
Yeah.
that level of pain. And I think that's what you were really saying. And honestly,
Hmm.
sometimes I just want to burn down the church. No, you didn't really want to burn down the church, but you wanted an avenue to express that pain and probably for the offending party to experience just a little bit of the pain that you were caused.
Yeah, you're exactly right. In our humanity, that's exactly what we want. And so, and because of that, then it just becomes complicated in how it's one thing to quote a Bible verse and, sing Kumbaya and talk about unity when everything is going great and we're not hurt and we're not misunderstood and, we're not, uh, talked badly about or, anything that happens in conflict. But then when those things happen, it's hard. It just is. It's hard to really put feet to our faith, but we can do it.
And I think you hit the nail on the head when you started to answer that question. That is, it's one thing when we're hurt by people who aren't professing Christians because we really can't expect them to act Christ-like. But
Right.
it hurts more when we have the expectation that we are going to be treated with respect. And, it's funny, I heard of a seminary professor every semester. He started off the same way and he'd ask his class, what brought you to the point that you wanted to be in seminary? And they're all like, well, I really just want to work with people. I love people. And his response was always, have you been around people? Because they're not working with people is not easy. And so
No, it isn't.
whenever we're going to be around people, and even, yes, even in the church, there's
Mhm.
that potential for conflict. But you believe that conflict actually serves as a platform for personal development. And so
Mhm.
that's a challenge to us. Talk a little bit about what you mean.
Yeah. Um, well, during that difficult season, I had to come to terms with something that I may, Michelle, have said, yeah, 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 yeah. I would have nodded and given an intellectual assent to this truth that I'm about to say, but I didn't yet have to really live it. And that is that you cannot change another person. You can only change yourself. And because what I wanted, in the midst of this conflict is for the other person to change or the other people to change, because truly, in my mind, it was, well, but you did what was wrong. I didn't do what was wrong. So I'm not the one that needs to change. You're the one that needs to change. And, sometimes that is the case in conflict, right? It's mostly, in most day-to-day conflicts, people contribute at least a little, but there are conflicts where it is more one-sided than the other. So then the great temptation is, I want you to change because everything would be better if you would just change. And in some cases, that's true. But the problem is that you cannot make another person change, which of course we all know. But when I got to the point where it was like, okay, Donna, I need to stop focusing and obsessing over the other people and start really assessing myself and how I'm dealing with this. That's when breakthrough started to happen for me because I kind of grew in my own self-awareness of how I handle conflict. I grew in my, frankly, Michelle, I grew in my relationship with the Lord because I really got to the point where I had to invite God into this and just say, God, this hurts. I invite you into this pain. I had to search the scriptures and go, I can't do anything about them, but I am responsible for handling my side of the equation according to your word. So, in the best case scenario, the way you can work through conflict is reconciliation. But even in the worst case scenario, when there's not reconciliation in a conflict, there can be personal growth because you surrender and you start to go, okay, Lord, this is where I really am putting my faith into practice in the really hard stuff of life.
And ultimately, you know, Romans 8:28 is often used as a cliche
Mhm.
band-aid,
Yeah.
but it is so applicable in so many situations. And when we can look at conflict as a platform for personal development, that is an opportunity for God to bring good for us
Mhm.
out of a really difficult situation. Hopefully for the other person too. But as you
Right.
said, we can't control them, but we can control how we respond to it and how open we are to the Lord doing a work in our own heart. Because sometimes I think we are blinded to our own responses and where God says, no, you had a part to play in that too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What is the single most important quality necessary for handling conflict in a healthy way? And
Hmm.
why is that important?
Yeah, there actually is one single thing that if this piece is missing, you cannot handle conflict in a healthy way. It's that important. And interestingly, Michelle, you brought up Romans 8:28. God causes all things to work together for the good for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. But Romans 8:29 is, for whom those he foreknew, he predestined to become conformed to the image of Christ. So how he works things out is he causes us to be more Christ-like. And that one quality that you cannot handle conflict well without is humility. And that's the mark of Jesus, right? And I find that humility is often misunderstood because, and misunderstood on one of two extremes, really. On the one extreme, people will say, well, humility is like kind of being a doormat. It's like not having boundaries, letting somebody do anything and everything. That's not humility. That's being a doormat. Or, humility is, we just we have all kinds of faulty notions about humility. Humility is not the same thing as humiliation, right? So humility does not make us a doormat for exploitation. It makes us a doorway for conversation. And that's the difference.
Say that
So
again.
yeah, so humility does not make us a doormat for exploitation. It makes us a doorway for conversation. So you can still be angry and be humble. You can still speak your mind and voice your thoughts, feelings, and opinions and be humble, right? You can still have boundaries and be humble because biblically, humility is strength restrained. So it comes from a place of strength. It doesn't come from a place of weakness. And see, when I allow myself just to be humiliated, that's comes from a place where I don't have a voice. I don't have, it's a place of weakness, not strength. But if I am choosing to be humble, that is me making a choice to restrain myself, right? And so it's so key because if we're not humble, we're going to be prideful on the one hand, or we're going to be resentful on the other hand, right? So it's this is huge, and it allows us to look at another person's perspective, not just our perspective. Humility. It allows us to listen. It allows us to speak. It just allows us to do so many positive things. If we can say, "Am I being humble here? Biblically humble."
So the one key ingredient, really, if we could grasp it,
Mhm.
make all the difference in conflict is having a humble heart.
Yeah. And this is interesting because I was, as you mentioned in the intro, I was a communications major at UCLA, interpersonal communications. And then I did my grad work in communications at USC. And I still remember being in one of the foundational communications classes at UCLA. And we had this world-renowned professor that came in as a guest lecturer. And she stepped up to the podium and she said, at its root, all conflict is really a power struggle. So think about that, whether it's your toddler or your teenager or your teammate at work, when there's conflict, at its root, it's really a power struggle, right? So it's who's going to get their way, whose voice gets heard, whose opinion is validated, it's a power struggle. So what ends up happening is that when conflict escalates, we're vying for power. You listen to me. No, you listen to me. No, you listen to me. No, 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 you listen to me, right? It escalates. This is why that humility is like the key, because humility doesn't play the power game. Humility takes the escalation and it de-escalates it. And that's why it is the superpower for handling conflict.
Wow, we could wrap up the episode right there, but we have too much other goodness to talk about. So, friends, we're going to take a real short commercial break. Think about where you can be humble in your relationships. We don't have to wait until conflict arises to exercise having a humble heart. But when we come back, we're going to talk with Donna more about when conflict hurts, choosing healing, honor, and hope over retaliation. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your Hope Filled Perspective, where my guest today is Donna Jones, and we are talking about when conflict hurts. We're talking about instead of retaliating, choosing healing, honor, and hope. So, Donna, why do you think most of us dislike conflict so much? And I don't know about you, but I go to great lengths to avoid it.
Michelle, you are not in the minority. I mean, no, nobody likes, I mean, it's the rare person that likes conflict, right? Because it's messy and it's complicated and it means we're not seeing eye to eye on something. And it's a headache. Let's just be honest. It's a headache at best. So therefore, we end up, in the book, I have something called the conflict continuum. And it's the way we handle conflict. So on one side are the people that are the avoiders, right? And to your point, you just said you like to avoid conflict. So it's kind of like you know, just make this go away, or peace at all costs, or they acquiesce. I'll just give in. Let's just do it your way, or it's not that big of a deal. Those are the avoiders. Or even even people that ghost people, they have a conflict and all of a sudden, okay, I'm just going to ghost them. I'm not going to call her back. I'm not going to see her anymore, have coffee with her anymore, right? That's an avoider. On the other extreme of the continuum are the attackers. And these are the people that think, well, as long as we're going to have conflict, I'm going to win. So there's that. I'm going to get my opinions across. I'm going to tell you why I'm right, and you're going to listen to me until you see things my way.
Or I'm going to gaslight you and make you
Yes.
think it's a certain way that it isn't really, which is another power play.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. And all of us know people who are on both sides, and even listening, we're probably like, yeah, I probably fall toward one or the other. But neither of those are biblical. or healthy.
Right.
So there's a sweet spot in the middle where we're not avoiders, we're not attackers, we are addressers. And these are the people who actually go, okay, this is conflict. Avoiding it is not going to make it go away. It's still going to be there and it's still going to be eating me up inside. Because let's just be honest, Michelle, you and I both know, and every person listening knows that even if we avoid it externally, internally, we're having that dialogue in our head. Why did they say that? Oh, I should have said this. I can't believe that happened. We're just replaying it over and over and over, right? It stays with us. And then the attackers, that doesn't feel good either, because if we're believers, there's a level of remorse maybe for the way we responded and regret. So the addressers are the people that go, okay, this is conflict, this is real. I'm not going to avoid, I'm not going to attack. We need to chat about this and let's address this situation. And that's the only way it gets better. And it's biblical. I mean, that's what Jesus told us to do.
In the book, you discuss 10 common mistakes that
Mhm.
make our conflicts worse, not better. Can you just talk about one or two of those? Friends, you're going to have to pick up Donna's book to find out about all of them. But give us a preview.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was writing the book, I was thinking, because I was, of course, immersed in this topic, and I was thinking, okay, if somebody, I'm a list maker, Michelle. So I'm kind of like a to-do, give me the to-dos and I can check them off. Or give me the not to-dos. And I can make sure I don't do those either. So if somebody would just come up with a list of things I'm not supposed to do in the middle of conflict and just put the cookies on the bottom shelf, that would be great. So, but there is no list, so I made one, right? So it's 10 things that make things worse, not better. And okay, so here's one that most people don't think of, but it's particularly lethal, and that's being dismissive. So when another person approaches us with a concern, when we say things like, again, like, oh my gosh, why are you making this such a big deal? Like, just get over it. Like, you're such a drama queen. All of those, or we roll our eyes, even though we're listening and we're nonverbally, that is basically saying, I don't care about you. I care about me. And whoa, if that is not the precursor to destruction of a relationship, I don't know what it is. Because when we are dismissive of another person's concern, we're basically disregarding them and it's disrespecting them. And you cannot have a relationship with disrespect. So, just think about with your kids or with your spouse. You know, if they're saying something's important to them, just pause and don't even if it seems ridiculous to you, just listen to them and don't dismiss it, because if it's important to them, make it important to you, because that communicates I care.
My husband and I just had this very conversation a couple days ago.
Really.
He was asking what was going on, and he could tell that I was not my normal self. And I recounted several instances. This is not about him, but other instances. And I said, I just feel like I've been dismissed. And it's a horrible feeling. So as you're talking about what that can look like, I'm thinking, ooh, I don't want to do that to other people because I know how bad it feels to feel dismissed. So I'm glad that you highlighted that one because you're right. It's not one that we would jump to
Mm-mm.
recognize quickly.
No, it isn't. It's a really subtle one, but it is, I think it's more lethal, especially in family relationships, than we even know. I think if we could interview our kids or our spouse and say, what makes you feel unloved? And they could articulate it, this would be one of their top 10 for sure. So I don't be dismissive. I would say that's a no-no. And then number two, I would think is the way we apologize. And sometimes we think, well, why should do I have to be the first one to apologize? I mean, maybe I'm speaking for myself, Michelle. But if my husband and I've gotten into a conflict, it's like, well, he should go first this time, right? So worrying about who goes first, or, and this is just as destructive, is to apologize, but add the word but. Well, Michelle, I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings, but and then because what that was really saying is the whole fault is yours. I would never have done what I did if you didn't do first what you did. And while sometimes that's true, that doesn't go far in healing or reconciliation, and it certainly doesn't show humility. So if we just own our part. We don't have to own the parts that are not ours because we don't want to over apologize or take responsibility for something we didn't do. And some women do that, frankly. So, I'm sorry, Michelle, that I talked to you in that tone of voice. That was really out of line. And I understand that I did that, and that's probably really hurtful, and I'm sorry. That's just
Goes
take a deep
such
breath.
a long way
Yeah.
in a conversation because you're really showing honor to the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I would piggyback onto that, Donna. Don't say, I'm sorry you feel that way,
Yes.
is
Yeah.
not an apology
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
because that's
Exactly.
not owning anything you did.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Can I tell you just a really quick story that was so eye-opening to me? So I spoke, this was years ago at a very large Christian conference center. And I happened to mention in my message something about humility. And after everybody left the room, the director of this Christian conference center stayed back. And she came up and talked with me privately. And she said, did you notice that my 20 something year old daughter was on the front row with me? And I said, yeah, I did. And she said, that was not possible 1 year ago. And I said, really? Well, what happened? And she said, when she was a child, she was delightful. And I wanted nothing to be more than just to be a godly, loving, Christian mom with a great relationship with all my kids. But when she became a teenager, our home was a battlefield. Like all we did was argue. And the minute she was 18, she was out the door. And she goes, Donna, I tried everything. I tried tough love, up love, down love, side love. I mean, I tried everything, right? And she goes, but the one thing I didn't do was really listen because, she'd been hard. So I had always been trying to get her to listen to me. And so she said, and I called her up and I said, I want to take you to lunch. And this is what I would like. I would like to give you permission to tell me everything that I did during your childhood or teen years that demeaned you, embarrassed you, upset you, hurt you. And I will listen and I will not say one thing. And so they agreed to this lunch. So they went to lunch and she said her daughter started talking. And she said, Donna, the minute she said the first thing that she had felt like I had done wrong, my natural response was to say, yeah, but you don't understand. Do you remember what happened? And the reason and she said, but I had made this promise. So I remained quiet. And I said, okay, what else? And then she said another thing, and then another thing. And then the floodgates were open. And she said, it was the most painful lunch of my entire life. But we got back in the car and I looked at my daughter's face and it was like she looked like a little girl again. I hadn't seen that. And she turned and she looked at me and she goes, Mom, that was the best conversation we ever had. But here's why. Because that mom, she did so many things right. It was humility, that was strength restrained. She didn't dismiss, even though she didn't agree with a lot of her daughter's assessment. She did not dismiss it. She heard it out. She didn't excuse it, and so it paved the way again. Then for that mom, her humility, she became a doorway then for further conversation. where then eventually she was able to, talk about her side and that sort of thing. But it was just such a beautiful example about somebody has to go first. Somebody has to go first. Why not me? Right?
And it's painful, but
Mhm.
it sounds to me from your recounting her story, it was pretty painful for years up until that conversation.
Yes, Michelle, that is such a good point. There was so much hurt and pain. And yes, that conversation, the addressing the issue, listening, that was painful too. But it was, I won't say it was the last really painful thing, but was one of the last really painful things that started then moving them from constant pain to this to this road to healing and road to reconciliation. And if she hadn't done that, she'd probably still be reeling in the hurt and the pain and the um, just the irreconcilable differences.
It seems like through this conversation, Donna, the word that keeps coming to mind is honor.
Mm,
Conflict doesn't usually honor another person. It stirs up pain and accusation and which produces resentment and guilt and remorse and all the things. But what you've shared today really comes back to honoring another person. It doesn't mean that you agree with them.
right.
And it doesn't mean that you don't have your own side and your own
Hmm.
justification. I'm sure that mom could justify a lot of what she had done from her perspective, but she honored her daughter to let her daughter talk, which
Hmm.
then showed her daughter that you are so important. I just want to hear what you have to say. And isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what drives so much of conflict is we feel like we're dismissed, we're
Hmm.
not seen, we're not heard. And that's what stirs us up to more conflict because we, as a species, we just want to be acknowledged.
Yes, yes. And Michelle, I would even add to that is we want to be understood.
Yes.
And we want to be understood. So the faster we can say, oh, we don't have to agree with it, but like, oh, I understand why you would feel that way. Then it makes the other person feel acknowledged and seen. And it takes this escalation that's happening with the power struggle because the person's saying, please understand me, please understand me, please understand me. And all of a sudden it just tones it down, right? And again, and I do want to say, that this does not mean that we don't have a voice and that we don't also say, our perspective, our opinions, but it's the way we do it is, like you said, with honor, honoring the other person. And that's the difference.
Friends, I really hope that you're getting something out of this conversation because I am. I'm thinking back on conflict that I've had that I could have handled differently. I could have handled better and I could have honored the other person instead of being so focused on explaining myself. Friends, we're going to take a real short break, but when we come back, we're going to wrap up the episode with Donna with a few more tips about how to choose healing, honor, and hope over retaliation. We'll be right back. Welcome back, friends. I hope that you're taking something from this conversation as much as I am. Or maybe this conversation was just for me today. I don't know. But Donna, I appreciate that you walked through this and wrote the book that we all need so that we don't have to walk through it.
Oh dear.
One of the things that makes conflict so difficult is that anticipation of the hard conversation. So walk us through how do we even approach having that hard conversation in a healthy, helpful way? Because none of us really wants to go there.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Okay, so as I was writing the book and I was processing, the content with my family members, one of my daughters said something to me and I thought, "Oh, this is so good." And she said, "You know what, Mom?" And she's in her 20s. She goes, "Whenever I have to have a hard conversation, I pray this, Lord, let this be a conversation of three, not two. And that's a game changer. So I would say that's number one. Just, Lord, let this be a conversation of three, you and me and the other person, not just two. And then, the Bible says if your brother or sister offends you, go to them and point out their fault. So you go to them, not to somebody else, hoping they will triangulate it. And then so and so will tell so and so that you got your feelings hurt. You go to the person and you talk to the person, not about the person. And when it says point out their fault, it's talking about like one specific thing that was an offense, right? So it doesn't say faults. So we don't wait until there's 20 things that we just, dump on a person all at once, because then there's too many things. Nothing can actually get sorted through or resolved. So you just one thing at a time. I want to talk to you about this X, and then come at it from a win-win perspective. So, and this I think is a game changer for me. This is what I do, and I'm going to give you a money back guarantee on this one. Um, if you can start a conversation with saying something affirming like, okay, Michelle, I know that you want to have as good of a friendship with me as I do. Because I love you and I think you love me too, right? So I know, and I know you're a godly Christian woman, so I know that you don't want conflict to stand in front of us. So see, I'm saying something that I know about you, right? About your character, about who you are. It could be with your child. I know that you would like less conflict in our home surrounding conflict or surrounding homework. And then the other person goes, yeah, I would. So see, now functionally, you're on the same side of the problem,
Hmm.
right? Husbands, I know that you would like us to get a better handle on our finances and stop arguing about this. And then husband goes, yeah, that'd be great. So now you're on the same side starting off. And see, that diffuses tension right from the beginning, rather than starting with, we need to talk, which then puts people at the defensive. So then it's like, okay, well, let's talk about this one thing. I'm going to point out this issue. And then, the Bible says if your brother listens to you, you've won him over, it's done. I mean, you don't have to talk about it anymore. If they don't, you have to revisit it a couple of times. But that's kind of the step by step of how you can start a conversation in a healthy way to um, heighten the chances that it's going to be a positive conversation.
And by doing that, as you indicated, it being a win-win situation, this is not putting the other person, then it's not setting them up where they've got to defend themselves.
Right, right.
And I think it's so important for us to remember that the enemy is the one who
Mhm.
sows discord. And so when we've been hurt, when we've been offended, when someone has done something against us, I think it's really important for us to remember that they're not the enemy, but our response to them sometimes communicates we think they are the enemy. I
Yes.
love your daughter's suggestion that she prays, Lord, let this be a conversation of three, not of two,
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
need the mind of Christ, especially when we're coming to our brother or sister with something. It's going to be a hard conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And one other thing too, I think, Michelle, is that to keep the problem and don't make the person the problem.
Mhm.
So when we start name calling, when we start, making the person the problem, you're so lazy, you never do that. Now that's putting the other person on the defense, and then that's just going to go downhill. It's not going to be helpful at all. So just, okay, what's the problem? What do I want to see? And sometimes it's helpful to say before you even get into the conversation, in the best case scenario, what would I want the end result to be? And then work backwards from that. Okay, if this is what I want, a solution to maybe no more arguing surrounding homework, or no more arguing over our finances, or you fill in the blanks. Okay, that's the problem. How can I work it back so that we're on the same page on this and the other person is is working with me, not against me on this.
Oh, such good advice. So, Donna, as we wrap up this episode, if a listener is resonating with this conversation, maybe they have to have a hard conversation,
Mhm.
or maybe they've been wounded by a friend or a family member. What hope-filled perspective would you want to leave them with today?
Yeah. Well, I would say that um, God sees you and he knows what you're going through, and that Jesus really understands relational heartache. Like he had a Judas in his life who betrayed him. He had a Peter in his life who, bailed on him. So he understands. And so you can go to him and say, okay, Lord, I am devastated by this. And he will not shame you. He will wrap his arms around you and say, I know. I know. I felt it too. It really hurts, doesn't it? But then also understand that there are so many things in the Bible that are instructions for how we are to relate, and even in the midst of conflict. And that's a really good thing because it's like God giving us a blueprint. He's like saying, I know that relationships are hard. So here, I'm giving you some practical tools about how I want you to handle the hard stuff. And, the book is filled with a lot of just biblical wisdom, practical advice, so that we honor God in the way that we handle conflict, even if the other person doesn't. Because honestly, Michelle, sometimes that's reality, right? So, and I go back to the point that I made at the very beginning, we cannot be responsible for another person. We cannot change them. We can only change ourselves. And we want to change ourselves to be more like Christ, which means we put into practice what he tells us in his word.
So good. Friends, I want to leave you with Hebrews 12, verse 14, that says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. And that's exactly what we're talking about, is that we want to emulate Christ. And so even if the other person doesn't change, we can change to become more Christ-like. Donna, this is such a valuable book. Remind us of the title and where we can find it.
Yeah, it's called Healthy Conflict, Peaceful Life, because isn't that what we want, right? The peaceful life. And the subtitle is A Biblical Guide to Communicating Thoughts, Feelings, and Opinions with Grace, Truth, and Zero Regret. And you can find it everywhere books are sold: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, my website, donnajones.org, christianbooks.com. It's everywhere.
Wonderful. Friends, we're going to put all the information about Donna, her ministry, her books in the show notes that you can find at drmichelleb.com. Friends, I hope that you took some real keen insights from today's conversation, because conflict is just part of our world. It's going to happen, but we can change our approach to conflict and live more peaceful lives. If you know someone who's been struggling with this, consider sharing it with them, because we always need a biblically based, hope-filled perspective. It's been a delight to be with you this week. We'll be bringing you another important topic next week. But until we're together then, it's my prayer for you that you have a hope-filled week.